This video is sponsored by Magellan TV. One of the Pacific theater's most brutal battles during World War II was the conquest of the island of Saipan in the summer of 1944. Part of Operation Forager, the Battle of Saipan was a U.S. offensive against Japanese ground and naval garrisons stationed in the Mariana, Palau, and Caroline Islands. Sergeant Thomas Alexander Baker, a young soldier of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, was part of the American forces that faced intense fire and ambushes as they advanced toward the island's center. Fatally wounded after American forces successfully repelled a 5,000-strong Japanese counterattack, Sergeant Baker asked to be left behind. The battalion was running out of ammunition, and he was not willing to risk other soldiers' lives for his own. Baker knew his time had come, and was ready to embrace it with a heroic last stand. He asked his comrades to lay him down near a tree to hold back the incoming Japanese. With no ammo left to share, one of his friends gave him a pistol with 8 rounds. As U.S. forces later returned to the battle scene, they witnessed firsthand the fighting spirit of the American warrior. Hideki Tojo ordered Japan to attack on Pearl Harbor and the invasion of Southeast Asia. He had his eyes on ultimate power, but the bravery of America's young soldiers in the Battle of Saipan would eventually bring his downfall. Learn more about the man who fought the dirtiest war ever known in the Magellan TV documentary Tojo, Japan's Razor of Fear. Magellan TV is a streaming service available across all of your devices that features over 3,000 documentaries, with new programs added on a weekly basis. Visit try.magellantv.com/darkducks for a 14-day free trial today. Watch Tojo, Japan's Razor of Fear, part of the 10-episode series Evolution of Evil that goes into the minds of the most evil men in history. Dark Ducks viewers can now take advantage of an exclusive offer, 30% off an annual membership. That's less than $3.50 a month. Visit try.magellantv.com/darkducks or click the link in the description below. This new offer is also available to returning members who have a lapsed membership. Japanese dominance. The island-hopping campaigns at the Pacific Theater in World War II were far more gruesome than what the American forces had faced in the Western Front. The level of violence experienced by soldiers in the Pacific was only comparable to that at the Eastern Front. There, Germans and Soviets were engaged in a bitter battle where every inch of land was fought to the last man. If the Germans had to endure the freezing weather of the vast Russian landscape during the first 3 years of the conflict, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps had to withstand the Pacific's hot tropical jungle heat for 5 long years. The heat, rain, and natural wildlife of the Pacific Islands posed a severe threat to Americans' health. It was no easy feat to fight against the environment, but the enemy was even harsher. The United States Marines, the smallest branch of the U.S. Armed Forces, were pitched against brave and restless Japanese warriors intensely loyal to Emperor Hirohito. Educated under the ancestral samurai code of Bushido, the Japanese soldiers, sailors, and Marines of the Imperial Japanese Army were taught to never surrender, even against staggering odds that threatened their lives. As far back as the 1920s, Japan had grown into a formidable military force that aimed to become the Pacific superpower. Before World War II broke out, the Empire of the Rising Sun had taken over most of Asia through a series of brutal campaigns in the late 1930s. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 after the U.S. oil embargo, the American armed forces did not have enough men or firepower to retaliate. But that would quickly change. American retaliation. When the Americans won the decisive naval Battle of Midway in 1942, which many historians consider the Pacific Theater's turning point, the Imperial Japanese Navy realized that they had underestimated their enemy. U.S. forces would continue to fight back until Japan surrendered. To do so, the U.S. realized that the only way to reach the heart of Japan was to eliminate the fortified Japanese garrisons scattered all over the Pacific Islands. As U.S. forces got closer to mainland Japan, resistance became unrelenting. Japanese soldiers were willing to fight to the end before surrendering. Headstrong Banzai charges and suicidal kamikaze crashes were some of the tactics employed to inflict as much damage as possible to the enemy. But the young Americans quickly adapted and retaliated with the same ferocity, conquering island after island with a newfound display of courage. Wake Island, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and many other islands succumbed to the brave American forces. But then came Saipan, one of the bloodiest and most harrowing encounters of the Asian conflict. The Battle of Saipan. The Battle of Saipan lasted from June 15th to July 9th, 1944. During almost a month of continuous conflict as part of Operation Forager, the U.S. Army lost around 14,000 soldiers out of an invading force of 70,000 men. The Japanese defenders lost 29,000 soldiers out of a 32,000-men battalion. But over 22,000 Japanese civilians living on the island perished when the Americans finally took over. Some were lost to starvation, others to indirect fire from both armies. Thousands of civilians gave up their own lives because Japanese soldiers told them that they would be either enslaved, tortured, or executed by the invading forces. Saipan and its surrounding islands were a top priority for the U.S. command. If conquered, bombers could be placed within the range of mainland Japan. Aboard 300 tracked landing vehicles, over 8,000 U.S. Marines landed on Saipan's west coast under cover of artillery bombardment on June 15th. As the men began to establish a beachhead, the Japanese waited. The Americans had previously placed flags on shore to set up a perimeter. When the beach was packed with amphibious tanks, marines, and supplies, the Japanese opened fire. Sergeant Thomas Alexander Baker Jr., a young private from Company A of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division, was among the first men to storm the coast. While the Marines fought on the west side, Sergeant Baker's regiment landed on Saipan's southern end on June 17, 1944. They initially met fierce Japanese resistance, but were able to make their way into the mainland. On June 19th, when the 105th was on its way to Nafutan Point, it was bogged down by Japanese pillboxes. Private Baker stormed ahead with a bazooka and single-handedly knocked down a Japanese emplacement. Along with his M1 rifle, he then cleared the path for his unit. As the battle continued, Nafutan Point was still a coveted spot for both sides. By June 27th, enemy resistance was reduced to 1,200 combatants. The Japanese eventually surrendered after being completely surrounded and under the heavy barrages of naval artillery. As Americans advanced through rugged terrain, many were injured or put down by enemy fire coming from concealed positions along the cliffs and caves. The area became known as Death Valley or Purple Heart Ridge. On their way to Mount Tepachau, the 105th had to move through the valley's thick jungle and cross a flat plateau where there was no cover. The men were exposed to enemy fire coming from high ground. While his unit advanced, Private Baker was assigned to a rear security position to prevent a Japanese counterattack. Most of the 105th had already gone through the opening when Baker spotted movement nearby. According to his posthumous Medal of Honor citation, Private Baker, quote, came upon 2 heavily fortified enemy pockets manned by 2 officers and 10 enlisted men which had been bypassed. Without regard for such superior numbers, he unhesitatingly attacked and killed all of them. 500 yards farther, he discovered 6 men of the enemy who had concealed themselves behind friendly lines and destroyed all of them. After the unit successfully crossed the opening thanks to Baker's team, the 105th joined the 23rd Marine Regiment and captured the villages of Dane and Hasigoro. By July 5th, the Japanese had nowhere left to go. Marines and army soldiers had almost taken over the island. Only the Tanapag Plain remained under Japanese control. American forces had firmly dug themselves in the area to prevent anyone from getting out. The Japanese prepared for one last desperate attack. A heroic action. The 105th was dug west of Tanapag near a railroad. On July 6th, the Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, decided to launch a desperate and violent final Banzai charge. Over 5,000 Japanese fixed their bayonets and got ready for close-quarters combat. Private Baker's perimeter was attacked from 3 sides. He was wounded twice by Arisaka rifle fire, but he kept fighting back. He emptied all his M1 carbine ammo and resorted to his .45 caliber 1911 handgun. When none of his comrades had any ammunition left, Baker got out of his foxhole and started charging Japanese soldiers by swinging his carbine as if it were a war club. After putting down a dozen soldiers, Baker was shot in the stomach and began to bleed out. The perimeter became indefensible and was overrun. As Baker's comrades were dragging him out to evacuate, one of them was shot. Refusing to let any of his brothers in arms die for him, Baker asked them to leave him behind. There was no point in risking more lives for him. After repeated refusals, his comrades left him in a sitting position near a tree. Baker's only request was to be given a pistol to keep fighting the Japanese. Before withdrawing, a soldier gave him a 1911 handgun with just 8 bullets remaining. There was no more ammunition. When American forces returned to the battle scene, they found Private Baker in the same position he had been left. The pistol he was holding was empty, and 8 Japanese soldiers lay around him. All of them had been shot by one .45 caliber pistol round. For his bravery beyond the call of duty during the Battle of Saipan, Private Baker was promoted to sergeant on May 9, 1945, and posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. It was a heroic last stand, and an emblematic display of courage that many unknown soldiers also showed in the war. Admiral and Commander of the Pacific Fleet, Chester W. Nimitz, would later say that the war was a conflict in which, quote, uncommon valor was a common virtue.